On the afternoon of September 14, 1978, a series of events unfolded inside a White Castle in Alexandria, Virginia, and these quiet moments ended up revealing a far larger Soviet intelligence effort operating right under the noses of people living and working near the nation's capital. The place sat just off U.S. Route 1, the busy line of traffic that carried commuters between Washington, D.C. and the wide suburbs stretching through northern Virginia. Every weekday, it pulled in a steady stream of government staff, military people, and contractors who often stopped in for a quick meal before heading back to their routines. The building itself was squeezed between a gas station and a plain strip mall, nothing fancy, nothing that would draw a second glance. Yet what played out there, hidden in the middle of ordinary noise and movement, turned out to be anything but simple. And the person who first noticed it wasn't a federal officer or someone using advanced surveillance gear, but an employee who happened to catch a detail that didn't line up. That employee was a 23-year-old woman named Claudia Herrera. She had been working at that White Castle a little over a year, long enough to know the usual rhythm of the place. Her job covered taking orders, operating the register, and doing regular cleanup around the dining area. She wiped tables, swept the floors, and cleared trash several times during each shift. Sometime around 2:30 that afternoon, as she moved through her usual tasks, something small pulled her attention away from her routine. A man who looked to be in his mid-40s had taken a booth toward the back of the dining room. He wore a dark suit, glasses, and carried himself like someone used to sitting alone. He had been there for maybe 20 minutes, eating in a slow, careful way, sometimes checking his watch but never showing any sign of rushing out. To Claudia, he seemed like the kind of customer who blended in, quiet, polite, and forgettable. Then another man entered. This one seemed younger, maybe late 30s, heavier build, dark hair. He came in, ordered at the counter, picked up his food, and took a booth on the opposite side of the room from the first man. He ate without looking around, and he never once turned toward the suited man in the back. The two of them didn't share a glance, didn't nod, didn't show any connection at all. Anyone taking a quick look would assume they were complete strangers who just happened to be eating at the same time. But what happened after the younger man finished his meal shifted the whole scene. He packed the leftovers into the brown paper White Castle bag, stood up, and moved toward the exit. As he passed the trash bin near the door, he placed the bag neatly on the flat top surface above the opening, almost like setting down a parcel, and walked out without even a glance backward. A few seconds later, the older man rose from his booth.
He walked straight toward that same bin, lifted the bag as if he had been expecting it, and stepped outside. Claudia had been wiping down a nearby table. She froze for a moment, cloth in hand, trying to sort out what she had seen. It looked deliberate, but she couldn't tell if it meant anything. Maybe the younger man had left something inside the bag by mistake, and the older man knew him and was picking it up. Maybe they had arrived together and she simply missed their interaction earlier. After a brief pause, she went back to her tasks, and by the time her shift ended, the odd exchange had slipped into the blur of the day. But 3 weeks later, the same strange pattern appeared again. On October 5, 1978, the same two men turned up at the White Castle again, and everything played out almost exactly as it had before. The older man showed up first, sometime a little after 2 in the afternoon, and slid into a booth along the far wall. He ordered his meal, ate at an easy pace, and kept waiting as if he had all the time in the world. After roughly 20 minutes, the younger man came in, placed his order at the counter, and picked an empty booth well away from the first man. He ate without rushing. When he finished, he headed for the exit and left his brown paper bag on top of the trash bin near the door. Just a few seconds later, the older man stood, crossed the room, picked up the bag, and stepped outside. This time, Claudia felt sure it wasn't chance. The timing lined up too neatly. Their movements looked practiced. These two were running some kind of routine, and they were putting real effort into avoiding any hint that they knew each other. That evening, she brought it to her brother, Bernard Herrera, who worked as a security guard at a federal office building in Arlington. She figured that if anyone would look at her observation with a serious eye, it would be someone trained to notice odd behavior. But Bernard brushed it off. He even joked that maybe she had stumbled onto spies meeting at a White Castle, a thought that sounded so ridiculous that the conversation drifted away from it almost immediately. Still, the joke didn't shake the unease sitting in the back of her mind. What she had seen felt intentional. It felt like it carried a weight that went far beyond the simple explanations her brother tossed out. She told herself that if she witnessed the pattern again, she would pay closer attention and decide what needed to be done. Taking the whole thing seriously, choosing to treat it as something that deserved real scrutiny instead of shrugging it off as chance or nerves, turned out to be the single choice that pulled apart an intelligence operation that had been running across Northern Virginia since at least the spring of 1976, if not earlier. On October 26th, she got the chance to watch more carefully.
As before, the older man arrived first and settled into a booth near the back of the dining area. This time, Claudia had asked a coworker, Kate Brown, to help keep an eye out. Kate had been working at the White Castle for about 6 months, and Claudia trusted her enough to bring her in, even though the whole thing still might have been nothing at all. The two women positioned themselves so they could see both the older man and the entrance without making it obvious. Around 20 minutes later, the younger man showed up. He ordered his food, carried it to a booth on the opposite side of the restaurant, and started eating. Claudia and Kate kept watching while going about their normal tasks, careful not to stare, but keeping both men in the corners of their vision. When the younger man finished, he wiped his hands with a napkin, then started gathering the last bits of his meal and tucking them into the brown paper bag he had brought with him. But just as he was about to pinch the top of the bag shut, he paused, slipped a hand into his jacket, and took out something small. It was quick, almost subtle enough to miss, and from where Claudia and Kate stood, it was impossible to tell what it was. Whatever it might have been, he dropped it into the bag as if it were nothing, folded the top, got to his feet, and walked over to the trash bin near the exit. He set the bag right on top, not inside, then walked out without looking back. A short moment later, the older man rose from his booth, strolled to the same bin, lifted the bag with an almost casual motion, and headed out of the White Castle. Claudia and Kate traded a look. Neither needed to say anything. The question hanging between them was loud enough. What had been in that bag? And why had the younger man slipped in something he had brought from his jacket, something he clearly hadn't picked up in the restaurant? The whole thing moved from odd to flat-out suspicious the longer they thought about it. Across the next 2 weeks, the women kept circling back to what they had seen. They talked about it on breaks, after closing, whenever the place was quiet. By the end of those talks, they had settled on a plan. The next time the two men pulled the same stunt, Claudia would place herself near the trash bin, pretending she was restocking or wiping down the area. Once the younger man dropped the bag and stepped outside, she would grab it fast and get it out of sight before the older man made it to the bin. Then she and Kate would take the bag to the back room, away from customers and prying eyes, and finally see what these men kept handing off. They knew it could get messy. The older man might say something, or push it, or make a scene. But Claudia figured she could bluff through it. She would act confused, swear she thought it was regular trash, say she was only doing what she was supposed to do. People forgot their stuff all the time, and she could use that to her advantage. On November 9th, 1978, the moment finally came. As usual, the older man showed up first and settled into his regular booth near the windows, the one that gave him a clear look at whoever came in. About 20 minutes later, the younger man walked through the door, and Claudia moved into position by the trash bin with a rag and a spray bottle,
pretending she was dealing with smudges on the counter and straightening small things that didn't really need straightening. When the younger man finished eating and headed toward the exit with the bag in his hand, she slowed her movements just enough to look natural while still watching him out of the corner of her eye. He set the bag neatly on top of the bin and stepped outside. Claudia gave it exactly 3 seconds, long enough for him to clear the doorway and reach the parking lot, before she grabbed the bag, shoved it deep into the trash receptacle, pulled the full liner out, tied it off, and started toward the back of the White Castle. She kept her pace steady, acting like nothing unusual was happening. Then a voice behind her cut through the noise of the restaurant. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, almost too calm. She turned and saw the older man standing there. His face was controlled, unreadable, but his eyes were locked on the garbage bag she was holding. He told her he thought she had thrown away his food, that he had left it on top of the bin and had been on his way back to pick it up. Claudia kept her voice soft and steady, trying to sound as harmless as she could. She told the man she hadn't known the bag belonged to anyone, that it had already gone into the trash and was mixed in with everything else, and that she could give him a refund or let him place another order if he wanted. The older man's jaw tightened a bit, like he was fighting back irritation, and he asked if she could just open the bag so he could take a quick look. Claudia repeated that once something hit the trash, the health rules stopped her from pulling it back out, that it was already touched by other refuse, but she would still be glad to give him his money back or arrange a replacement meal. He didn't answer at first. He stood there in a short, tense silence, as if he was running through the choices in his head, trying to decide whether pushing the issue would make things worse or draw eyes he didn't want. Then he gave a small shake of his head and told her it wasn't needed. Without another word, he left, moving toward the exit with a pace that was a little faster than when he had first approached. Claudia watched him step outside and disappear onto the sidewalk before she headed for the back of the White Castle. In the storage room, out of sight from the dining area and the counter, Claudia and Kate shut the door behind them and locked it. Then they opened the garbage bag. They sorted through napkins, plastic cups, oily wrappers, and finally found the brown paper bag they were looking for.
Claudia handled it slowly, her fingers unsteady, and reached inside. She pulled out 2 small photographs, each only a few inches in size, printed on regular photo paper. The pictures showed what looked like pages from typed documents. There were columns of numbers and text, clean technical diagrams, and several stamps and markings in the corners that hinted at official restrictions. Anyone who had ever glanced at government forms or military files would recognize the style right away. These weren't personal snapshots. They were pictures of restricted papers, the sort of material that should never sit outside a protected room, much less hide inside a fast food bag, pass between 2 strangers in a public place. They didn't need to debate anything. The choice was obvious. This had to go to the FBI, and it had to go fast. Claudia and Kate slid the photos back into the bag, then sealed everything inside a larger plastic one so any prints or residue would stay intact. Later that afternoon, after Claudia's shift was done and she was far from the restaurant, she called the FBI field office in Alexandria. The agent who answered sounded doubtful at first. Tips about secret activity uncovered by fast food workers rarely grew into anything real. But when Claudia described the photographs and said she could bring them in herself, the tone changed. The agent arranged a meeting for the next morning and told Claudia and Kate not to mention what they found to anybody, not even co-workers at the White Castle. On November 10, 1978, Claudia and Kate reached the FBI field office, walked inside without delay, and sat down with 2 agents who guided them through the whole process.
The agents took their statements one point at a time, looked through the photographs with care, and pushed for any details the women could recall about the two men, the timing of each exchange, and any small thing that might help make sense of what had happened. Every photograph was logged as evidence, tagged and sent on to analysts at the FBI laboratory, as well as counterintelligence specialists working at headquarters in Washington, D.C. About a week later, the answer came back. The documents shown in the photographs were not fakes or harmless printouts. They were real, and they clearly came from within the Department of Defense. The material pointed to satellite reconnaissance programs and technical data that carried high-level classification, the kind that only people with strong clearance could ever access. It became clear that Claudia had not stumbled onto some simple mix-up or low-level theft. She had stepped into the middle of an ongoing espionage effort, and the people behind it were active and confident enough to keep running their operation. By November 15, 1978, the Bureau had formed a task force to take over the case.
It was led by Special Agent Richard Kellerman, a counterintelligence veteran with more than 15 years of experience chasing Soviet operations across American cities. He had handled work in New York, Los Angeles, and Washington, and he knew the signs of professional tradecraft after seeing countless dead drops, brush passes, and coded signals. When he reviewed the details of what had taken place at the White House, the pattern stood out to him right away. The conclusion was clear. Claudia had witnessed a classic dead drop, a quiet method used to shift sensitive material between an asset and a handler without any spoken exchange or risky meeting. The strength of the technique was in how simple it looked to outsiders and how hard it was to connect the people involved. When done cleanly, it left no obvious trail. If one person was compromised, the other could step back, disappear, and never be linked to the one who got caught. But this time, things had not gone as planned. The bag had been taken before the older man could reach it. That mistake opened a rare chance for the Bureau to learn who was stealing the information and who was receiving it. Kellerman and his team began shaping a plan. They decided to run steady surveillance at the White House during the hours when the earlier drops had taken place. From what Claudia remembered, the timing pointed to Thursday afternoons between about 2 and 3 o'clock. They believed another attempt would come within the next 2 to 3 weeks, assuming the network had not panicked after the failed pickup on November 9th. Agents would sit inside the restaurant as ordinary customers, watching without drawing attention. More agents would wait in cars outside, ready to follow either man the second he stepped out. If everything lined up, the task force hoped to track both individuals long enough to expose the chain behind the operation and finally shut it down. The aim was to watch the handoff, track both men, see where they went after leaving the White House, and gather enough proof to justify arrests and federal charges that would hold up in court. The surveillance started on November 16, 1978. Agents worked in steady rotations, so no single face became too common to the usual customers or the staff who knew the place well. The first week slipped by without a hint of activity. The White House kept its normal rhythm, office workers stopping in for a quick meal, families drifting through at odd hours, kids crowding the booths after school. But the two men Claudia had described never showed. The second week played out the same way, the same ordinary scenes repeating day after day. By the beginning of the third week, the strain inside the task force was obvious. Some agents were convinced the whole thing had already blown up, that the older man's encounter with Claudia had spooked the Soviet network enough to shut down the location entirely. Others complained that they were wasting time and manpower on a dead spot. Kellerman pushed back. He kept saying the network had used this method for years, and losing one exchange wouldn't make them abandon something that had worked so reliably. He thought they might try to rebuild the routine once they felt the heat had faded. On December 7, 1978, Kellerman's confidence paid off, though only partly. The younger man stepped into the White Castle a little after 1 in the afternoon, and the update went straight across the radio to the surveillance teams. But there was a change this time, something off about the way he carried himself. Within minutes, the agents watching him could see it too. He looked uneasy, almost jumpy. He kept scanning the dining room more often than Claudia had ever described. His movements were sharp, hurried. His eyes swept across the booths and tables like he was searching for someone he expected but couldn't find. He placed his order at the counter. The undercover agent, standing 2 people behind him, could hear his voice, tight and low. The man took his tray to a booth near the back and started eating, though it looked more like he was passing time than having a meal. He kept checking the entrance, watching every single person who stepped inside. The older man never came. Minutes dragged by, 5, then 10, then 15, and still nothing. The younger man finished the food, left the trash sitting on the table, ignoring the bin by the exit, and walked out. Agents waiting in unmarked cars picked him up as soon as he stepped onto the sidewalk. They stayed well back as he moved through the streets, heading to a parking lot about 3 blocks away. He climbed into a late-model sedan and drove toward the edge of Alexandria. The tale lasted another 20 minutes. Agents kept their distance, shifting positions so he wouldn't spot a pattern. Eventually, the younger man turned into the parking lot of a small apartment complex tucked inside a quiet residential area off Seminary Road. They watched him park, noted the address, wrote down the license plate, and marked the building number he entered. Then the teams pulled back, careful not to stir anything that might warn him he had been followed. And then they cut off the surveillance. They did not want to risk giving themselves away by following him inside or by keeping their car in a spot where a strange vehicle would draw notice. During the next 2 weeks, the team kept watching both the White Castle and the apartment complex where the younger man had been seen. They also ran background checks on the car's registration. The results pointed to David Allen Becker, a 38-year-old technical analyst working for a defense contractor known as Systems Analysis Corporation, a company that handled classified projects for the Department of Defense. More digging showed that Becker held a security clearance that let him reach materials tied to satellite reconnaissance systems, communications procedures, and the technical details of hardware used in intelligence work. He had been in that role for almost 4 years, starting in early 1975. His personnel file looked clean, no warnings, no money troubles noted, no discipline problems, no failed polygraphs. On paper, David Becker seemed like the steady kind of mid-level contractor the government counted on to keep sensitive programs steady and predictable, but the facts they were gathering were starting to point in a different direction. The younger man showed up at the White Castle one last time on December 21st. He arrived by himself again, moved around like he was checking for anyone watching him, stayed only a few minutes, and left without speaking to a single person. The older man, the same one Claudia had watched pick up the bag on 3 earlier occasions, never came back. It looked more and more like something had shaken the operation in a way that could not be repaired. Kellerman decided it was time to act. Waiting any longer risked losing the trail or giving Becker enough time to notice the pressure, run, or destroy anything that could tie him to the activity. On the morning of December 23, 1978, FBI agents carried out a federal arrest warrant and a search warrant at Becker's apartment just after dawn. They stopped him as he stepped outside on his way to work and put him into custody. Right after that, agents started a careful, room-by-room search. What they uncovered backed up their growing suspicions. In the bedroom closet, pushed under a pile of folded blankets, they found a 35mm camera and several rolls of undeveloped film. In a desk drawer, they located handwritten notes that listed technical details matching material Becker would have been able to see through his job at Systems Analysis Corporation. In the kitchen, taped to the inner side of a cabinet door above the refrigerator, They found an envelope holding nearly $8,000 in cash, arranged in neat stacks of $100 bills. Becker was taken to the FBI field office in Alexandria and placed in an interrogation room. For the first 3 hours, he kept silent. He stated his right to stay quiet and asked for an attorney, offering nothing more. As the morning slipped into afternoon and agents laid out the evidence piece by piece, Becca's confidence thinned out. After a short talk with a public defender and a blunt rundown of the sentences he could face under espionage laws, he gave in. He agreed to work with the investigators, hoping it would help him later when a judge decided his fate. Over the next several days, he walked the FBI through his actions. What he shared lined up with the investigation, but also irritated Kellerman and his team because it showed how simple the breach had been and how long it had gone unnoticed. Becca said he had been taking photos of classified documents for about 2.5 years, starting in the spring of 1976. He used the small camera the agents later found in his apartment, copying whatever papers he could reach through his job. He said he had been pulled into this by a man he knew only as Victor. The two first crossed paths in a bar near DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C., sometime in late March or early April of 1976. The approach had not been rushed. Victor eased into it with small talk, a drink, and a few casual meetings spread over several weeks. Each time they met at a new place, always in public, always with enough background noise that no one would pay attention to their conversations. It all felt normal enough that Becca didn't question it at first. Then Victor finally laid out what he wanted. He said he worked for a group interested in certain technical details the United States had chosen to classify. According to him, this information never should have been hidden because it was scientific work that belonged to everyone, not something one nation should lock away. He framed it like a moral issue, playing on Becca's irritation with slow government processes and rules that made no sense. But when that angle didn't land right away, Victor switched tactics. He asked about Becca's finances. Becca admitted things were rough. He had debts, and his wife's recent surgery had left more bills than he could manage. Money was tight and getting tighter. Victor told him there was a simple way out. All he wanted were copies of some documents, nothing that would put lives at risk, nothing that would disrupt military planning, just technical sheets and data that, as Victor put it, would balance things out between countries. In return, he promised steady payments starting at $500 for each exchange and later climbing into the thousands. Becca insisted he acted out of financial strain, that he felt cornered and that Victor played on that pressure until Becca gave in. But to the FBI, his story didn't soften anything. Their view was plain. He understood exactly what he was doing, and he chose to trade his country's secrets for cash. The dead drop at the White Castle was Victor's idea, put in place sometime in the late summer or early fall of 1976, after the first handoffs had gone through other channels that Becca either couldn't piece together anymore or said he didn't remember clearly. The setup was plain, and Victor kept telling him it was almost impossible to mess up. Becca would take photos of the papers whenever he got the chance, develop the film with the chemicals and gear Victor had given him, and slip the prints into his White Castle bag during lunch. The whole thing took less than a minute.
No talking, no glances, nothing that anyone nearby could point to or record. For a little over 2 full years, the method held steady through dozens of drops, right up until the afternoon of November 9, 1978, when Claudia Herrera snatched the bag before Victor could touch it. Becca said he had stayed in the parking lot that day, same as always, waiting to see Victor come out with the bag in hand. When Victor stepped out of the White Castle empty-handed, Becca knew the routine had broken. He followed the emergency steps Victor had laid out. He marked a utility pole with the sign they had agreed on and stayed there expecting Victor to answer the signal. But Victor never answered, not that day or any day after. When investigators pushed Becca for anything solid about Victor, what he gave them shifted, thinned out, or felt like it had been shaped to hide more than it revealed.
He spoke of a man in his mid-40s, close to 6 feet tall, brown hair showing gray at the temples, and a faint accent that Becca thought sounded Eastern European, maybe Russian, maybe Polish, maybe Czech. Past that basic picture, he said he had nothing real, no family name, no home, no number to call, no clue where Victor spent his days or what false identity he used to blend in. Every bit of contact between them had gone through a signal routine that kept them apart on purpose. Whenever Becca had something to pass along, he put a strip of red tape on a certain mailbox along Route 1, roughly 2 miles south of the White Castle, on any Tuesday they used for drops. Victor answered by chalking a mark on a nearby utility pole on Wednesday, which told Becca the handoff would happen the next afternoon. The FBI ran Victor's description through their files on known or suspected Soviet intelligence officers working inside the United States. They came up with around 40 possible matches, but none tied cleanly to the man Becca had sketched out. Nothing strong enough to bring anyone in or open a deeper case. Kellerman figured Victor was a deep cover asset using a made-up identity backed by a careful legend, the kind meant to hold up under casual checks and leave no trace that investigators could track later. Kellerman reached the uneasy conclusion that the only practical way to pin down Victor's identity was to draw him out, using Becca as the lure and trusting that, sooner or later, Victor would slip. On January 9, 1979, with Becca fully on board and the FBI watching every step, agents marked the agreed-upon mailbox along Route 1 with a strip of red tape. That simple signal told Victor that Becca supposedly had another set of materials ready for pickup. The Bureau had spent days assembling a batch of forged documents, careful imitations of classified files tied to satellite reconnaissance, but filled with information that was either old, bent out of shape on purpose, or flat-out useless to anyone trying to gather real intelligence.
The idea was to have Becker stick to his normal pattern, the same routine he had repeated countless times. He would show up at the White Castle that particular Thursday afternoon, order his usual food, sit down, finish his meal, then set the paper bag on top of the trash bin by the exit before walking out. Agents would be scattered through the place and in cars outside, ready to close in the moment Victor touched the bag. Kellerman and his team got to the area early that morning and took their spots without drawing attention. 2 undercover agents blended in as customers inside the dining room. One sat near the front windows with a street view of the entrance, while the other settled into a back booth close to the spot where Victor tended to sit. 3 more agents waited in unmarked cars in the parking lot, keeping an eye on every angle. Across the street, a surveillance van loaded with radio gear watched both the restaurant doors and the Route 1 access lanes. Claudia Herrera and Kate Brown were on shift that day, and FBI agents had already coached them to behave like it was any other shift, not to stare at anyone, not to break their rhythm, and not to let even a hint of tension show. Anything odd could spook Victor or anyone working with him. David Becker stepped into the White Castle a little after 2 in the afternoon, right on schedule. He placed his order, found a seat halfway through the dining area, and ate without rushing. Agents kept quiet eyes on him as he wrapped up, gathered his empty containers into the brown paper bag, and walked it over to the trash bin near the exit. He set the bag on top, just as he always had, and headed out the door without looking back. The bag stayed there, plain as day, for a minute, then 2, then 5. Kellerman, watching from the van, felt his heartbeat crawl up as the silence stretched. 10 minutes went by, then 15. The bag still sat untouched. Customers wandered in and out, some glancing at the bag as they thrust their own trash, but no one reached for it, and no one lingered in a way that suggested interest. When 20 minutes passed with nothing at all, Kellerman knew what it meant even before anyone said it out loud. Victor was not coming. There was nothing left to wait for. One of the undercover agents inside the restaurant was told to retrieve the bag, and the operation was shut down for the day. Surveillance at the White Castle dragged on for about 3 more weeks. Agents kept showing up during the same hours when earlier handoffs had taken place, hoping Victor might slip back into the routine, but he never appeared. They also kept an eye on the mailbox and the utility pole that had once served as quiet signaling points, watching for even the smallest hint that Victor wanted to reconnect with Becker. Nothing. No chalk marks, no strange scuffs, no signs that Victor was still nearby or even still working in the country. The FBI kept pushing the case forward for several more years. They pulled the file every so often, reviewed old notes, and compared Becca's description with newly identified Soviet officers. Each time, they hoped a detail would line up, but every review ended the same way, with no real leads. Becca sat for several more interviews as well. CIA counterintelligence teams questioned him again and again, trying to see if age or distance from the events might help him remember something small about Victor's face, voice, or habits, anything that could tie into another investigation. But Becca stayed firm. He said he had shared everything, that Victor had always held back pieces of himself and had never allowed personal information to slip. David Allen Becker faced several espionage charges under Title 18 of the United States Code. In March of 1979, after weeks of back and forth between his lawyer and federal prosecutors, he chose to plead guilty to giving classified material to a foreign government without authorization. On April 12, 1979, he stood before a federal judge in the Eastern District of Virginia to hear a sentence. During that hearing, his attorney asked for a lighter punishment. He said Becca had been pushed and pressured by an experienced intelligence officer, that Becca had helped investigators as much as he could once he was caught, and that he was honestly sorry for what he had done. Prosecutors pushed back hard. They argued that greed had driven Becca from the start, that he had taken thousands of dollars over more than 2 years while passing secrets, and that his cooperation had not produced any useful information about Victor or the wider Soviet network suspected of operating around Washington. The judge listened to both sides, went through the record, and then sentenced David Becca to 18 years in federal prison. He said Becca's choices had harmed national security, and whatever break he might have earned for cooperating was weakened by the fact that his help never led to any new arrests. Becker ended up serving 11.5 years before gaining parole in November of 1990. The White Castle in Alexandria stayed open for about 20 more years after 1978, but the operation that had once run quietly in its shadow was gone for good. And the whole thing wrapped up not thanks to some clever counterintelligence trick or fancy surveillance gear, but because one sharp-eyed worker saw a guy keep placing his trash on top of the bin instead of dropping it inside. It struck him as odd enough to check again, and that small moment of doubt ended up exposing what had been going on for much longer than anyone expected.